we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. Welcome to the podcast if you're first time listening. If not, welcome back. If you're first time listener, if you want to support the podcast, go check us out at patreon.com/the Bigmark podcast. And there's different tiers there you can support the podcast with, and there's all kinds of exclusives there. Also, you can follow along the podcast either on Twitter or on Instagram at the Bigmark Pod. Go ahead and send us a DM if there's anything you'd like to hear or want to talk about. Please give us a shout. We'd love to hear from you. Today, I'm really looking forward to today's episode. You know, it's one of these, one of the topics that really, you know, has always intrigued me and I've always wanted to do as an episode. And, you know, shout out to my boy Larry Bird over here. If anyone's ever noticed my little trinkets over here, Larry's in almost every episode. Including my boy K-Man, the Kramer. He's over there doing his thing. Yeah, there's kind of a story that I don't know how well known it is with people who aren't necessarily into basketball, let alone sports, specifically basketball, and then basketball like in the late 80s, early 90s, when I'm sure most of our listeners weren't even necessarily alive. Or at least really young, like myself. It was a different era of basketball. It was a different era, you know, obviously not only the fact that it was literally in a different era, but just different style, different kind of athletes that you're going to get playing, and just a very different NBA than it was now. But anyway, I really like to talk to you about the story of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. You know, these two intense, fierce competitors that, you know, their story is actually amazing. They ended up becoming best of friends, and yeah, just a tremendous story. They're kind of one of those, I want you to think when you're listening to this today, I want you to think to like your best friend. I'm sure some people might even have several best friends, but think of your best friend now, even best friend from childhood. And this is going to be like that relationship between Larry and Magic is very similar to, I'm sure, what a lot of people have experienced with their best friend. You know, people, when Larry would go by himself somewhere, when Magic would go by himself somewhere, everyone would always ask, where's Magic? Where's Larry? Right? And I know I've had friends like that in the past where if I'm not around them, everyone always asks me where my buddy is. You know, in an interview, a lot of the excerpts from today's episode are also in ESPN documentary called Magic and Bird. Really interesting documentary. Magic and Bird: A Courtship of Rivals. Check it out. Super cool interviewees. A lot of interesting journalists and stuff from people that were involved at the time. But in one of the interviews, Magic was saying, you know, they have a relationship where you don't have to call or say hello, but when they're together, it's like they never skipped a beat. And, you know, there's something special about those types of relationships, right? You know, and it's always interesting how they kind of are forged too, right? Because, you know, relationships and friendships for that matter come from many different backstories, and they have all these different ins and outs, as it were. And like I said, you know, for the rest of the episode today, just think back or think about your best friend. Where things kind of all started for Magic and Bird was probably March 26, 1979. It was in Salt Lake City, Utah, and Michigan State Spartans were playing the Indiana State Sycamores. So Michigan State is where Michigan State is where Magic Johnson went to, and Indiana State Sycamores was this really small little kind of college no one really knew, but that's where Larry was from, and he was the man. He kind of brought their whole team to the final. Magic was very talented, but he also had a really talented team with him too, so he wasn't completely on his own. And of course, both of them being in the NCAA final, they're the best two teams in the country that year. And essentially, well, I'll get into what happened in that game, but that was kind of where they were introduced to the public. A little bit about Magic Johnson first before we get into anything else. I want to Tarantino things a little bit. I want to show you a little bit of the future. I'm going to bring it back. So Magic Johnson, better known as Irvin Johnson, grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, kind of just outside Detroit. Watched his father work 2 jobs. His father worked for GM, and he actually won an award for never being late or never missing a day. So, Irvin always kind of had that in his mind. Irvin Sr. actually, that Irvin would watch his father, go to work and work hard, and that really influenced him in his game and his work ethic. And from a young child, Irvin knew that he was going to play in the NBA and become a businessman. That was his life's goal, and so far he's done it. He would play basketball until the lights went outside, not come back for dinner. His family would come and bring him food. Before Irvin was still in elementary school and he was planning to go to high school, in his neighborhood, he was planning on going to the predominantly black high school. But at the time, in the mid 70s, Michigan was starting to bus kids to desegregated schools. So this is still a time in America where there were segregated schools, T.C. Williams style, like Remember the Titans kind of stuff. And it's like, man, like they're reintegrating these schools, and there was just like lots of turmoil happening, things like that. But Irvin just took it in stride. It never really bothered him. As the story goes on, it's going to be. I wish I could do this podcast for 2 hours, because there's a lot of ins and outs here, but hopefully you'll start to catch on a little bit about each one of these guys' personalities. And Magic is he's a larger than life character, and it doesn't surprise me that he kind of took this whole thing in stride. So he joins the basketball team at the school, of course, and in his debut game, a high school, a local reporter actually gave him the name Magic. And at first, Irvin was kind of like, oh, Magic, like, I don't know about that. But then people kind of started calling him that around school, and his buddies started calling that, and obviously it stuck. In his senior year at Everett High School, which is the high school that Magic went to, they actually won the state championship. Right after that, he committed to Michigan State, and that's probably the first time he actually heard of Larry Bird, because Larry was starting to become a little bit well known in the NCAA because of his stats that he was putting up. Tremendous shooter, just big rebounds, just catching the eye of everybody. While Magic and Larry were both still in college, they were chosen to play for Team USA in an international tournament. Again, this is back in the 70s, and if you guys want to go watch another one of our podcasts about the 1992 Lithuanian national team, before 1992, you weren't allowed to be a professional athlete and compete in international sport or in the Olympics for that matter. So when Larry and Magic were playing for Team USA in the 70s, obviously they were on Team USA as the actual team, and then they'd go in and they would scrimmage other NCAA teams in the country and just like get after it for an international tournament. And that's when that's when Magic really noticed how good of a player Larry was. And he actually said, Larry's the baddest white dude he's ever seen to his friends. Like, he was letting everybody know, like, this guy doesn't mess around. On Team USA, like I mentioned, they would scrimmage NCAA teams, and they'd be up by 10 points, and then Larry and Magic would go in, and it would instantly jump up to 20 or 30. Then they'd get pulled out, and it would drop back down to 10. They'd put Larry and Magic back in. So again, from an early start, they had that natural chemistry on the court, probably because they actually had very similar games, which is really interesting. Larry said about Magic, there's something about Magic that makes you want to play better, makes you want to make that extra pass. And it's really interesting, when you do play with better players, how much better they do make you. I think I mentioned before, when I was playing rep basketball in Hamilton, our head coach was the assistant coach for Master Marauders basketball. Shout out Blessed Sacrament. Shout out Jeff Joseph. And he would let us scrimmage against guys that played on the men's basketball team at Mac. And at the time, I was in grade 9 and grade 11 when I was playing for the teams. Excuse me. So it was like these guys were much older than me, but it was great, and it made me much better player. So, again, Magic kind of had that skill because he was such a great player. It would just be contagious to his teammates. The problem is Larry and Magic, apart from their chemistry on the court, they didn't really interact off the court. I mean, Larry, as I'll go on to explain, Larry's kind of a little bit more reserved compared to Magic's a little bit more outgoingness. Again, Larry preferred to keep to himself, and he didn't like interviews. He didn't like talking to press. He didn't like, and he kind of saw it. It wasn't necessarily all press. It was just certain interviewers that would kind of get him to say things that he didn't necessarily want to say, or just trying to, he was more concerned, or not concerned, but he just didn't understand the fact that some reporters were asking him all these questions about stuff that didn't pertain to basketball. And that's what kind of bugged him. So that was his kind of deal. But again, like I said, a little bit more about Larry. So Larry Joe Bird grew up in South Indiana in French Lick, Indiana. Shout out French Lick. It's a really tough working class area. Lots of hardcore racism. It was kind of the home of the KKK at the time, but Larry never really bought into that. Again, playing basketball, he, would try and find the best players in town to play with, right? Because again, like I said, you got to play against the best people, and all those people that he could find that were the best happened to all be black. So he never really saw it as a racial issue. It was just those were the best guys to play with, and they let him play, and they were nice to him, and he never really had an issue that way. But it's interesting growing up in the area that he did. Like when Larry was a kid, he didn't know that people were millionaires. He didn't even know that people had family cars. It was just kind of one of those things growing up in this little tiny town. They were happy. They did their thing. So growing up, Larry and his brothers kind of gained a reputation for fighting with each other and everybody else. Like if one of the brothers got into a fight and the other brothers didn't kind of step up to help, the father, Joe Bird father would beat the kids and say, listen, you got to stick up for your brother and you got to be tough and whatever. Larry and Joe were particularly close. They would fish and they would hang out and they would do their thing. However, it was a little bit tough because Joe Bird struggled with trauma from the Korean War. He would have night terrors, and he also kind of developed a drinking problem that really strained his marriage to Larry's mom. But Larry was Larry just was still friends with his father. Obviously, they were still close no matter what. But maybe that kind of contributed to a little bit of Larry's shyness. But who knows? Again, Larry being quiet and keeping to himself really stemmed into school as well. He took an F in a project because he didn't want to go up and speak in front of his friends. So, guy's a shy guy. He's a shy kid. But basketball really came to him easily. He excelled in French Lick, and everyone kind of was like, oh yeah, he's just in French Lick. He's not playing anybody. But that definitely just kind of put a little bit more fuel in Larry's fire and just made him play even better. So much so that he caught the attention of Bobby Knight from Indiana University, recruited Larry to come out. Larry goes out there, first couple weeks on campus, he's overwhelmed. There's tons of people there. He's a small town boy, and he knew he couldn't cut it. So 24 days in, he dropped out. Larry went home. He worked for the city. His mom was super disappointed with him, and he wasn't really looking to go back to university just because he kind of got spooked. That same winter, Larry and Larry's mom were having difficulties. They had split up already. Larry's Joe Bird was late on some payments for the alimony or child support or whatever, and the cops were going to go pick him up. And obviously it's a small town, so they knew everybody. So Joe calls the cops and say, hey, can you just give me a few minutes to kind of get my affairs in order, and I'll come down to the police office, whatever, and police station. But anyway, he ends up calling Larry's mom and says, listen, you guys are going to be better off without me. And he hung up the phone and killed himself. So it was really tough on the family, really surprised. Larry obviously took the family by surprise, and Larry really never talked about it. He was kind of angry at the time because he kind of thought his dad kind of checked out on them at a tough time, but at the same time he understood his pain, so he never really talked about it. But it was something that he kind of kept down, and it was really, really tough on Larry, and it was something that he didn't want to ever have to relive, of course. So in comes Bill Hodges of Indiana State University, who actually convinced Larry to give basketball another shot. In fact, if it wasn't for this Bill Hodges character, we may have never even heard of Larry Bird. So Bill gets Larry out to Indiana State. Larry brings them to the 1979 NCAA finals, and that's where this whole journey starts for us, where Magic and Michigan State were waiting for them. Again, because Magic and Larry had played together on the U.S. team, Magic kind of expected to greet his former teammate, say, hey, how's it going, buddy? But Larry didn't want to have anything to do with it. He calls it his love fest. And I totally get that. I've experienced playing against friends, and it's tough, man. You can't really have that same kind of killer attitude that you would just playing against a stranger. And in fact, I'm sure any athletes listening, I've played against a lot of guys that I've kind of made up reasons to dislike them, and then ran into them later for whatever reason and got to know them, and they happen to be the greatest guys. And it's one of those things where you kind of kick yourself after, because you're kind of like, man, why was I such a dick? But like I said, like I know personally, I just couldn't play my best, whether it was basketball or football, or I couldn't be the best athlete I could be if I was playing against a friend, just because I wouldn't go as hard. So I totally understand where Larry's coming from. So obviously for this game, for the 1979 NCAA final, the media coverage was huge. Larry and Magic were rising stars, but Bryant Gumbel actually said if Larry Bird was black and from Chicago, it wouldn't have been such a big deal. But in the fact that they were just completely polar opposites, with Larry being the quiet, reserved guy from the country, and Magic being, the loud, boisterous guy. One guy's white, one guy's black. One outgoing, one shy. This sentiment was essentially echoed throughout their whole careers, that they were just the polar opposite, and it was always kind of exploited, even though their games were so similar, which is really interesting. So in the game, Michigan State basically played a box and one, 4 guys on Larry and 1 guy on everyone else. Wasn't necessarily exactly like that, but basically, unfortunately, Indiana State wasn't very strong. They had Larry Bird, so they were kind of like, all right, we're going to be okay. He got him to the final, but again, it's hard to win a championship game when you don't have a whole squad to kind of back you up. There are 5 other guys on the other team too. So essentially Indiana State got outplayed. Larry never really got over this loss. It was really tough loss for him. He felt that was the only way for him to really get redemption for what happened at Indiana, maybe, is to try and win this for Indiana State. But who's to say, Magic came out on top on that one, unfortunately. After the game, obviously Larry and Magic knew they were going to be seeing each other a lot on the court, because Larry got drafted by the Celtics and Magic got drafted by the Lakers. So they knew that this wasn't going to be the last time that they faced each other. That's for sure. A little bit of an aside, in the 1970s, the NBA kind of was crumbling. Fan support was really down. No one really knew what was happening. A lot of people were kind of checked out after the ABA merger in the mid 70s, where it brought on a whole bunch of new teams and a whole bunch of new players that had a very different attitude than kind of like your Jerry Wests and, you know, Pete Maravich's from the 60s or whatever, that it was all about the basketball and really, really kind of straightforward. A lot of people were saying, sorry about that, folks. A lot of people were saying, you know, it's potentially was too black an NBA for the 70s. It was hard for the white fans to relate. And again, this is from a different time and a different era, and, you know, different for different strokes for different folks, I guess you could say. Again, that and the ABA merger potentially brought a little bit more selfish style in play. And it was really tough for the NBA to get sponsors because of this, because of just this general outlook on the NBA, which is too bad. So because with Larry coming into the NBA, and obviously everyone knew about him and knew how great of a player he was, people really started labeling Larry as the great white hope, and thought that he would really revive the league with his skill and bring a lot more attention and show that there are good white players out there too, I guess. So the problem was many players that were in the NBA really questioned whether Larry would really live up to the hype. The thing is, Larry showed up to training camp at the Celtics. He dominated. It was really great. Obviously, again, it's hard. I don't want to go into too many specifics. I don't really have the specifics, but it's hard to really quantify how good both these guys were, Magic and Larry, how skilled these guys were. Obviously, there's some game film that you can still go back to watch, but this was such a while ago that it's really hard to actually understand how strong and how good both these players really were. But when Larry showed up, you know, he went hard, played the game hard. He was tough, hardworking, really, really brought that kind of mentality from watching his father work hard. And people in New England and Massachusetts and around Boston really appreciated that. They're a hardworking area. And when they saw Larry working hard, and it wasn't necessarily pretty all the time, but he got buckets and he got the job done. So Larry led the Celtics to a championship in his second year, and again, just propelled him into the front lines of the media. But he just continued that whole vibe of just really kind of really pushing away from that whole idea that, you know, he doesn't want to talk about anything other than basketball. Even with some of his teammates, Cedric Maxwell was saying, you know, it was tough to even talk about him with anything, you know, American history, nope, you know, current events, nope, but basketball, they could talk about it all day, right? So Larry was, you know, he liked to keep it himself, but they kind of referred to him as the Wizard of Oz. And he would go to his house. He lived out of town, and he just wanted to go from there to practice and games and back. The one thing that he did let people do and come see him was that he'd let people come and watch him cut his grass on Saturday morning. So you could go watch Larry Bird cut his grass. And that was really the only caveat he really gave the public, which is interesting. You know, again, during this whole thing, even though Larry got his first championship under his belt, he never lost sight of Magic Johnson. Really watched him. You know, it was something that actually kept Larry going a lot. It was something that he really focused on. But so while the Celtics were doing their thing, the Lakers were kind of having their issues too. In the 1970s, so this is before Magic joined the team, they had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, obviously lots of talent there, but they just lacked that kind of energy that they needed to really like get things going. So with them drafting Magic, they really thought that they could bring that to the squad. And funny enough, after Magic joined the team, it's the first game of the season. They're playing the Clippers or something like that, and Magic and the Lakers beat the team, and Magic was so happy, and he was embracing Kareem like they just won Game 7. So clearly, Magic was gonna bring a whole new idea and a whole new mentality to the game, which is super cool. In 1980, which is Magic's rookie seasons, the Lakers. In 1980, Magic's rookie season, the Lakers won the NBA championship. So this is without Kareem. Magic played in Game 6, all 5 positions, and won, eventually leading to the championship for the Lakers. In just 4 years, if you're listening closely, that means in just 4 years, Magic won a high school state title, an NCAA championship, and an NBA championship, which is pretty cool. Of course, after this, Magic became an instant star in LA and all over the world for that matter. After the championship, he signed a 25-year, $25 million contract, and he basically became the Prince of LA. The Lakers owner, Jerry Buss, who his daughter, I think, is the current owner today, took him to the Playboy Mansion and would introduce him to the LA scene, if you know what I'm saying. So Magic wasn't really into drugs, don't get me wrong, but he really enjoyed the ladies. But he still had that old school hardworking mentality where, he wasn't going to try and cloud his mind with anything, but, his vice was women. Let's just put it that way. It's interesting, and I could probably do a completely separate podcast on this whole thing, but Magic really saw I don't know, it's hard to say this sentence, but Magic really saw Irvin Johnson as an alter ego. So Magic really saw himself kind of as this dual personality of Magic Johnson and Irvin Johnson. And he saw Irvin as this, light, funny, likable guy, fun-loving, the kid from East Lansing, and Magic as this tough competitor, almost like larger-than-life kind of like movie star type guy, LA type dude. So, again, this alter ego kind of started really dominating. The more Magic would win, the more his personality became stronger. Fascinating. Anyway, so finally Larry and Magic got to play each other for the first time, and this is in their rookie season, and they had a hard foul, and that kind of set the tone for the beginning of their pro career. So both of them are playing for the first time, LA Lakers versus Boston Celtics, and they just friggin' smash each other. And it was, Larry admits that, he kind of he instigated this whole thing. He created the atmosphere because he kind of couldn't compete against someone he likes, like I mentioned before. He generated that whole hate and that whole kind of negative attitude. He was also really jealous of Magic winning the NBA championship in their rookie year. Not only the fact that he lost to them in the NCAA, but the fact that he couldn't get an NBA championship. Funny enough, Magic was jealous of Larry, even though Magic had won an NBA championship. Magic was jealous of Larry because that year Larry won Rookie of the Year. So again, it's this back and forth kind of, they're equals yet opponents. Very, very interesting. So during this whole process and after that first year, Larry actually started to become obsessed with finding out how Magic did, looking at the box scores, looking at the newspaper from the night before, watching the highlights, seeing how Magic did. And Larry said he saw it as a crutch, and he saw it as someone who he could compare himself to. And it's really interesting. I don't want to go too far into this, but it's really interesting. These two guys were the best of the best. So when you're that good, I'm sure it's actually very difficult to find someone else to logically compare yourself to. So again, this became something that Larry kind of needed to do, which is really cool, or fascinating at least. I don't know. It's something that players can get overwhelmed with. I think the competitiveness, although it can be an edge, obviously, as we know, the competitive edge, but it's kind of something that it can kind of take over a player's psyche, I feel sometimes. But again, like I've mentioned before, as much as Larry and Magic kind of competed against themselves and viewed each other as the other on the court, they were doppelgangers. Essentially, their similarities lied in the fact that they were both team-oriented stars They both cared about winning above all else. They weren't selfish. They were both basketball savants that focused, that fused the substance of the 60s with the style of the 70s. They created a new but selfless style for the 80s. And both of them were kind of two halves of the same brain, where in some circumstances you get certain players that shine in very specific aspects of the game. Larry and Magic were both very all-around players, offensively, defensively, everywhere, shooting, passing. Just again, they were the all-around player, which is rare to find, that can excel at that level. Now, before the 82-83 season, this would have been about 2-3 years of the boys being in the NBA. CBS and the NBA actually made a deal to show as many Lakers and Celtics games as possible. So they'd show double headers. They'd show, the Lakers playing somebody, and then they'd show immediately the Celtics playing somebody. And that's just how they did it. It boosted ratings like crazy. People were watching the games now. And it just kind of went wild. Essentially, again, CBS was smart. They saw it as this rivalry made in heaven, and it truly was. Again, outgoing Magic versus quiet Bird, East versus West, black versus white. The Celtics had a lot of black players, but the country saw them as a white team, which is weird, just because of Larry. But again, that just became that racial dichotomy too, which is really interesting. Larry and Magic finally met each other in the finals in 1984 too, which again, funny with all the ratings that they were getting that they ended up in the finals together. But what can you do? It actually went to 7 games. Celtics won at home, and of course was the highest rated game in NBA history at the time. But as much as TV made the rivalry real, the players were the ones. This wasn't just something that was manufactured. This is something that ran deep with these players. And again, because of the racial elements of it too, it kind of, all those black players that were saying, hey, listen, what's so bad about playing for white team, number one, and two, we're not white, we're black. So what's the issue? Let's just play basketball. But it started to trump all that. Cedric Cornbread Maxwell said, if I had a glass of water and any of those guys would have been on fire, I would have drank the water and watched. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, these guys actually hated each other like bad. In 1985, Magic and LA actually beat Boston in their house, even to even the score in the NBA Finals. So back-to-back LA Celtics Finals. Celtics take one, LA take another. Wild. So in the midst of all this craziness, Converse actually convinced Magic and Larry to shoot a commercial for the Converse Weapons. It's a shoe that they had in the summer of 1985. Now, again, this is at the height of these guys' rivalry. So the last thing these guys want to do is get together and film a freaking commercial. You know what I'm saying? So Bird was like, no chance I'm going to LA. He made them film in French Lick at his mom's house, which is hilarious. They had a basketball court there and stuff. It's obviously nice, but still. And both guys are thinking, what's going to happen here? Because the first scene is a one-on-one scenario, and they go, is this real or is this fake? Like, what's going to happen here? Of course the directors go, guys, this is just for fun, don't, and it just kind of relief kind of washed over both of their faces. They do a couple scenes of dialogue, they get after it, and then they break for lunch. Larry's mom feeds feeds everyone in the crew, and Larry and Magic get to talking, and they start to get to know each other, and Magic drops his guard, and like they say in the documentary, Larry met Irving that day. So it's really interesting, again, to the fact that this guy's personality essentially is so strong that he has to shut it off and turn it on. But again, that's elite sport and elite competition. You know what I mean? It's intense. It's intense psychologically. But even after all that, Larry left it all there. He still wanted to be at arm's length. He didn't really see them as good buddies now. And when Magic and Larry got back on the court, it was just kind of it was back to old ways, right? When they were getting after it. When the commercial came out, it actually only solidified the polarization of Larry and Magic. It was something that people said, okay, listen, maybe the business is starting to trump everything here, but it still permeated through culture, right? Kids wouldn't want to wear their black sneakers because they didn't want to support Larry or vice versa. You know what I'm saying? So again, all this stuff, whatever sponsorship that one had, all the white people wanted Larry stuff, all the black people wanted Magic stuff. There's people even in Boston, black people from the black community that didn't want to have anything to do with the Celtics because they were just seen as that. And this polarization was just so heavy duty. And again, played up by the media because it just made for it was just such an intense story. It grabbed everyone's attention. And again, it was an easy dichotomy to understand too, right? Like I've mentioned everything before, they're complete opposites of each other. So it was easy for people to find something that they appreciated in one or the other, or both. And even both, again, if you just appreciated the game of basketball that these guys were playing, it was amazing. So after Larry won his third championship and third consecutive MVP, Larry started attracting negative attention from black audiences. So things started almost tipping for Larry. As much as he was the great white hope and he was always receiving negative attention for that, things were kind of starting to tip a little bit because he was just so successful. At the time, two players from the Pistons, Dennis Rodman and from the Detroit Pistons. Two players from the Detroit Pistons, Dennis Rodman and Isaiah Thomas, said Larry was overrated because he was white. A teammate actually ended up telling Larry this in the locker room, that they said that, and Larry just said so. It's just something that didn't really bug him. And again, Larry didn't see race. He didn't see, even though he grew up where he grew up, it wasn't something that came up. And he knew what the score was, and he knew that there's different communities out there, but again, he didn't see that it had to be such a difference. And he was a good player. Who cares if he was black or white? He was a tremendous player and a dominant player. So, again, this just became bigger than Larry and Magic, which is really tough. And again, Larry kind of bore a lot of probably unfair negativity from people because of just his position and who he was. So, after that, the Lakers and Celtics actually met for the third time in the finals, and the Lakers went on to win against the Celtics at home. And in the final press conference, Larry admitted to Magic being the best player he's ever seen. And, people kind of were shocked by this, right? Again, it's something that you're admitting of your sworn rival. And it was kind of seen as somewhat of a passing of the torch, that, Magic was continuing to just get better and better and get into the prime of his career. And, Larry saw that and he acknowledged it. While this was happening, the more Magic won, the less Irvin was around. So again, like I said, his lifestyle and the more he actually won on the basketball court, it actually fed into that alter ego of Magic, and that lifestyle came along with it. And Magic said he had to have all these women and that lifestyle and that whole thing around him because it kind of kept him in that whole Magic mindset. And again, if we do look at it like a character he was playing, he was just setting himself up to be in that, like a method actor. He was just surrounding himself with the people that kept him in character, which is fascinating. Again, we could do a whole other podcast on the psychology of that. But while this was happening, Larry actually broke his back redoing his mom's driveway one day. Larry Bird, NBA star, out there shoveling gravel, literally breaking his back. And it obviously negatively impacted the rest of his career. While Magic was in the prime of his life, Larry's career was deteriorating with his back injury. He had to lay down on planes. He ran the risk of permanent injury or paralysis. And when they asked Larry, he said he probably should have retired, probably in the late 80s, but he just wanted another chance to play against Magic in the finals. Unfortunately, it never happened, but he just wanted that opportunity again. So a couple years later, in 1991, Magic's sitting at home waiting. They're about to play another game. Magic gets a phone call from the Lakers doctor telling him he had to get back to LA, get down to the Lakers facility. They got to talk to him about something, right? And he goes, what is it? And they're like, we can't tell you over the phone. Just come on down. We got to chat with you. When he got to the Lakers facility, the docs sat him down and said, with the physical that we gave you, your annual physical, we've discovered that you are positive for the HIV you are HIV positive, and it was tough because at the time, not much was really known about HIV and AIDS. Late 80s, early 90s. I'll probably end up doing a podcast on that whole the AIDS crisis, but it was a newer disease. People didn't really know what was happening. People were getting it and dying. There's nothing that medical science really could do at the time. So this seemed like a death sentence, and to compound things, Magic had just gotten married. He had a 2-month-old baby. Luckily, they did not contract the disease, but it was something that he was worried about. And again, it shook up everybody, and it shook up the league, but it really shook Larry up. And he said he hadn't felt that way since his dad died, and he really just needed to talk to Magic. And they had a really nice phone call together, and it really choked Magic up to say, when something bad happens to you and there's certain people out there that are going to call you and know that and tell you it's going to be all right, it means a lot, right? Especially from your best friend. And like I said, Larry hadn't felt that way in a long time. He never thought he would feel that same way, and it stayed with him for a while. And Larry went on to play continue to play, but obviously was affected with his friend not being there, right? And like I said, because people didn't really understand HIV and AIDS, Larry probably thought Magic was going to die, and so did a lot of other people. And in a press conference, Magic addressed what was happening. He let everyone know what was going on, and that he was retiring from the NBA, and that he was going to beat the disease. And people thought he was just lying to himself, and just it was really sad. I mean, obviously to this day he's beaten it. He's great. Obviously, good on you, Magic. Like, for sure, it's amazing. But again, it's one of those things where it's like, man, the guy's positivity just kind of really shone through. And even at the time, people were kind of like, I don't know about all this. That night after the press conference, Larry and the Celtics had a game to play, and it was the first time Larry didn't want to be on the court. It was something that, again, he was sad for his friend and he was worried about him, but it's like, he probably saw it also as, what am I doing here? There's so much more to life than basketball, and I'm out here playing. And I mean, I'm not going to get inside his head and speak for him, but again, you've lost your friend and the person who you're most competitive with too. All of a sudden they're gone. It's going to really take that kind of luster off out of the game for sure. And again, not only did Larry kind of, was probably on his way out because of his back, but, with Magic not being there, it was devastating. But, talk about devastated. Magic was most devastated, not only with everything that was happening, but because he was such a social person, he was so upset that people didn't want to shake his hand or give him a hug again. And, you know, it really just shook him to the core. And it was tough, but, you know, because of the position that he was in, Magic went on to be a national HIV educator for the American government. So under the Bush administration, you know, he went out and was educating people on the disease and getting more awareness out there, because again, early 90s, people didn't really understand what was going on. So after the season that Magic retired was over, he was invited to play in the 92 All-Star game. You know, there was enough evidence at the time that they knew that he wasn't, other players weren't going to be able to contract a disease, you know, just by playing with him. And at the All-Star game, Larry and Magic actually announced to the world that they were starting the Dream Team, or the U.S. was starting the Dream Team, and that they're going to go to Barcelona, and they called it Win the Gold for the country, and they ended up doing it. Again, you know, that was the same Olympics that I mentioned in the 1992 Lithuanian National podcast. So if you guys want to go and listen to that one after this one, lots of cool stuff. Really interesting story there. And with the Olympics, you know, Magic saw it as an opportunity to spread awareness about HIV, and again, show that you can't get it from playing against him. And of course, he got to play with Larry again. And, you know, what made their friendship so special is they never tried to change each other. You know, Larry was the kind of guy who, he's a straight shooter. He'll tell you he doesn't like you. He'll tell you he doesn't like what you're saying, but he'll tell you he loves you too, and he'll mean it. And then, you know, Magic's larger than life. He can change a room. And each guy said, you know, I wish I was a little bit more like that. And I think that's the most special thing with your friends, is that, yeah, you might be different, but it's about the differences that it's loving the differences that make you special. And I think that, you know, a lot of people want to change others, even if it's their friends. They want everyone to kind of follow along and live in their world, because everyone thinks that they have it figured out. And you know, it's totally fine on your own thing, but, you know, appreciate your friends, appreciate their differences, appreciate their special skills, and know that, you know, you guys are both two sides of the same coin, and you gotta work with each other. And sometimes one can be like fire and one can be like wood. Fire burns wood, but the fire cannot burn without the wood. So sometimes things aren't always give and take, things aren't always equal, but you need each other just as much. And, you know, I think Larry and Magic had this, and, you know, they have a connection that they can only truly grasp, and it's a true friendship. And like I said, think about your friend, give him a call, shoot him a text, say you love him. I love you too. And again, you know, if you want to support the podcast, go check us out, the Bigmark Pod on Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. You can check us out on Twitter at the Bigmark Pod, and on Facebook at the Bigmark, on Instagram at the Bigmark Podcast. Again, drop us a link there. Let us know what you want to hear. Let us know what you like. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button. You know, hit the subscribe button. Check us out. Give us a good rating if you have a chance. Please do. Tell a friend. If you all go out and tell a friend tonight, today, whenever you're listening, we'll double our audience just like that. So please do. I love you all. You know, go check out some old Magic and Bird footage and see what I'm talking about, and go hug your friend. Love you guys. Talk to you soon. See ya.